Hello, ladies and a few good men, and welcome to the Autoimmune Rehab Podcast, where today I am excited to have Amy Behimer on here. Amy is also the host of an autoimmune podcast herself, and we will talk a little bit about her story behind her podcast, how she came to create it, and a little bit about herself. So, Amy, why don't you get started by telling us a little bit about you?
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Amy Behimer, and one of the first hats I always identify as is I am a MS warrior. I've lived with MS since 2012, amongst a couple other autoimmune diagnoses that we can get into later. In addition to that, I'm a pharmacist. I've been a pharmacist for over 15 years, working in a hospital. And more recently, the past few years, I have become a health and wellness coach, and really am just on a mission to help others with autoimmune diagnoses really start to love their life by feeling better today and worrying less about tomorrow, which, if your listeners have an autoimmune disease, I am willing to bet they may guess, or I'm willing to bet that they may experience some worry about tomorrow when we're given these diagnoses.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think so. And MS is really a big one. It's like, I think a lot of listeners may have things like my personal story with Hashimoto's, things like that. And while at times those can seem big, but in the long game of things, they're maybe not quite as big as something like MS. MS is, that can really wreak havoc on a lot of people's lives. So tell us a little bit about how did you get diagnosed, what was going on in your life, that kind of thing.
Sure, it's interesting you say that, because in my mind, I kind of also think of my diagnoses as big, little, important, not important. And I've really come to realize that they all are big and they all are trying to tell us something. And my first was I was in my teens and I was in high school and I started getting white patches on my face. And so people may be familiar with vitiligo, which is an autoimmune disease. And I just kind of kept on living, kind of thinking, okay, well, this is something that affects how I look, but not really thinking anything else of it. I then went to pharmacy school, started learning about how these autoimmune diseases can sometimes cluster. And that kind of planted a seed in me of, oh, goodness, like I wonder if because I have one, if I'm going to have more. And so, sure enough, a few years later, in my mid-20s, I was diagnosed with Graves' disease, which is an overactive thyroid autoimmune condition. And by that time, I was starting to really wonder, okay, something may not be happy inside my body. And at the age of 27, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So that was my biggest at the time, to use your words as well. And it really was the one that grabbed my attention to say, I am not going to wonder anymore in terms of what my body may not be happy with. It's time for me to start to get serious to figure out what this looks like so that I'm not continuing to accumulate diagnoses.
Well, yeah, that's a lot. I think you're one of the few people I've talked to that actually had thyroid issues first and then got MS. That's pretty that's pretty
Yeah,
extreme. So
it's,
what
yeah,
was the very first action step that you took to start your healing journey or to say, hey, whoa, something's got to change here?
great question. For me, it started with a curiosity and a knowing that maybe the foods I was eating weren't what was going to help my body heal. I grew up on a pretty standard American diet, meaning lots of ultra processed foods. Grew up with uh, siblings and, a mom that worked, and she was a single mom. And so it was just eating out of convenience. I can't even tell you how many pops, I'm from Michigan, so we call it pop, but how many pops I drank, how many packages of ramen noodles, how many bagel bites and pizza rolls and things like that. So the food was the biggest thing that piqued my curiosity when I first got started looking at what parts of my environment or what parts of my lifestyle may be impacting this.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's I've heard the statement said a couple of times that if you eat the standard American diet, you'll get the standard American diseases. And
Gosh,
that's
that couldn't
kind of where you
That could not be more true. And so with me, I really went all in on looking at my food. And it wasn't until a couple years after my MS diagnosis that I ran into the TED Talk from Dr. Terry Walls, who really is a pioneer in
Mhm.
the functional medicine space. And, you know, she was a physician speaking about evidence-based medicine principles helping with MS. And that just really grabbed my attention of we really are onto something here. And so I read that book for the first time in 2014 and haven't really ever looked back. So going on a decade of putting a lot of those principles into place, not only food, but all the other areas of lifestyle that really impact our health, not only today, but absolutely the health that we're going to have tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, she really is a pioneer. If you aren't familiar with who Dr. Walls is and the Walls Protocol, you definitely want to research it because I've heard about it quite a bit from quite a few people. And yeah, she definitely is pretty well known in the space, especially with MS, but principles can apply to other autoimmune conditions as well. And so
Absolutely.
once you started doing that, about how long do you feel like it took you before you really noticed a difference in how you felt?
Well, with all in lifestyle factors, food is just one piece, and that's true for the Walls Protocol too. Um, I started feeling better almost immediately. I don't know if it was as much the direct result of the food I was eating, but it was really the empowered feeling that the things I was doing was making a difference, not only today, but into the future. And so, really starting to believe that the choices I made were going to make a difference had me more and more curious to try new things, more and more curious to look at areas other than food as well. And so I started feeling better from both respects pretty immediately.
That's awesome. That's great. And so let's talk a little bit about, so obviously you've told us that you're a pharmacist as well. So prior to that, like you were already a pharmacist when you got your MS diagnosis, correct?
I was, yeah.
How did that impact your career and your job, your ability to do the job? Did you end up having to take time off for a little bit, or were you able to keep going? How did that look?
That's a great question. For anybody who's familiar with MS, there's a few different kinds. One is relapse remitting, which is about 90% of people with MS. And that looks like kind of peaks and troughs where you can have a relapse. You can have some pretty significant symptoms that kind of take you out of your daily living, but then for the most part can expect a good deal of recovery. I'm in that smaller percentage where it looks more like a primary progressive type. And so I never had symptoms or episodes that really wiped out my ability to work and to function. So I fortunately was able to keep working. I'm still working and able to do so. A lot of what takes people with MS out of the workforce is actually more related to cognitive effects or brain fog or difficulty concentrating or really just extreme fatigue. And I really credit the lifestyle changes that I've made with my ability to stay sharp and to stay focused and to really avoid that extreme fatigue or that inability to think clearly. And, I also do share that I am on a disease modifying therapy. So I like to say that conventional medicine and lifestyle or functional medicine does not have to be an either or. I have decided that they both have a huge role in my health and in my future. And so, that may change if things change or if I started developing side effects that were bothersome. But at this point, I really do stress that I take advantage of both sides of that coin.
That's good. Yeah, I think because I know personally for me, I grew up primarily in a more of a holistic environment and home, it was kind of the opposite of yours. My mom made homemade whole wheat bread and lentil and
Wow.
pea soup and all the homemade stuff, and I tried to avoid the doctor and all that kind of stuff. So when I first got my Hashimoto's, and it was diagnosed by a naturopathic doctor, and he told me I was bad enough I had to take thyroid medication, I resisted it and I didn't want to take the medication. But now
Yeah.
that I've been on it for a little while, I've started to realize that, sometimes you need those things, and I've talked to enough other people with autoimmune conditions to realize that no, it's not one of those things that you can just pop a pill and expect everything to be okay.
Yeah.
But sometimes you do need the pill. And that's just, you
Yeah.
just have to realize that science and medicine and traditional healthcare is out there for a reason, because there are benefits to it sometimes. So
Absolutely. There's a time and a place, and everybody is so unique. And that's one of the big things I stress when, because now I get to work with, folks who have autoimmune disease, and any advice, whether it's about medical care, whether it's about lifestyle, any advice that is offered by someone who doesn't know you and your specific, wants and needs and dreams and situation is brittle and a little bit dangerous, because it really takes that individualized knowledge and work to make these things apply to you.
absolutely. Yeah. Which is another one reason why, of course, we always recommend that you can listen to as many of these podcast episodes as you want. But if you're in the situation of trying to heal from an autoimmune condition, you're going to need a whole team of people, from your doctor. Ideally, if you're on medicine, a good pharmacist, you're going to probably need some kind of health coach. Maybe even chiropractors can be helpful, acupuncturists, that whole team of people to help you. Because just sitting here listening to podcasts, to us talk about our stories and what we did and what we might do is not necessarily going to help you if you don't get that personalized one-on-one help. So
You're so right. And one of the biggest problems we have with the reason change is so hard for people is that there's not enough encouragement of action with the learning that we do. So, for everything that we consume, what are we doing to put it into place in our own lives? So, every lesson I teach, every podcast episode that I put out, it's always, okay, we've learned. Now, what are we taking action on, and how are we making this a reality for us?
absolutely. So let's transition now, Amy, to talking a little bit about your podcast. So she has a podcast, and she'll explain a little more about it, that focuses a lot on habits for autoimmune health. So how did that come about?
Sure, sure. So it's called the Habit Hub for Autoimmune Health. And the first, piece of that is habit. And I love habits so much because they are a universal language that most people have heard of habits. They have either a really loving relationship towards them, or maybe they may be frustrated with them because they feel they're not having, the habits that they'd like. But whatever your relationship, a habit is proven by science. There are tons of amazing researchers out there that are continually putting out great evidence-based information about habit change. So that really speaks to me as my pharmacist, and in my training, that they are backed by science. Not only the science of habit change, but the actual lifestyle habits that we do cover. The hub is so important in that because, there's 6 key spokes in the habit hub. And those 6 key spokes are the areas of lifestyle that we have control of, no matter who we are, to make, small shifts to help lead to, healthier lives and happier lives. And the hub is so important because if we focus on one area and neglect another, I'd like to say that that leaves us having a bumpy ride. And I'm the first person to admit that, like I mentioned, I went so hard on the nutrition and the food as medicine spoke myself that I really neglected rest, and I neglected mindset. I always say you can't outnourish a crappy mindset. So the hub really helps me stay grounded, and it helps me help others stay grounded in looking at our health as on that big picture, on that even balanced wheel of the hub. And then the last piece is autoimmune health. I mean, we all most likely have an autoimmune disease diagnosis, but that may be leaving out the parts of us that are healthy, and the parts of us that we are contributing to becoming more healthy. So I like the term autoimmune health, and I will often talk about creating autoimmune health because I want to make sure that we don't just get lost in the disease side of things.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah. And the concept behind habits and the science behind it, I think, has really exploded in the last few years. Like I was reading or hearing somewhere that the book Atomic Habits, which if you haven't read it, you really must read it, was, I think,
Yes.
the number one best-selling book, like period, worldwide last year, I think in 2022 or something. And so, people are becoming more and more aware about the science behind habits, the importance of habits, all the different habits. And like you said, it's not just about the food. And I try on this podcast to share with people a lot of other things besides just food. In fact, we don't really even focus that much on food, even though food is important. So yeah, I love that concept behind it. That's
Yeah.
great.
And I love, people who come to work with me, they most likely have one area that they know they want to get started working on. And that's always a great place to start. Where do we want to start? And the great thing is, once we start creating the skill of making and breaking habits, it doesn't matter what area of our health we are working on. That skill is transferable when we want to look at another area. So the skill of making the habit of moving more, or eating better, whatever that looks like for someone, that can be applied to when we're ready to rest more. That can be applied when we want to work on our mindset and work on our relationships with our diagnosis and with others. So yeah, you're right about Atomic Habits, though. James Clear has absolutely found a way to speak to people in a way that has them listening. And I love when people, will get on their first call with me and they have their copy, like they're excited. So I love when people get excited about habits, because it really is the boiling down of these big, exciting goals of a lifetime. It's boiling them down to what we're doing today, which is really empowering.
That's awesome. Cool. So, what last words of wisdom would you have for anybody that's listening to this, would you say? Anything I haven't covered?
I would say that the biggest thing I would love people to take away is that we can start these things today. Time is going to keep marching on either way. And so it doesn't have to be this big, pause life or wait for life to get calmer, because when is that really going to happen? Or wait for a certain thing in the future to put yourself first and to put your, health top of mind. So if health is a priority, I really encourage people to look at where are they investing their time and their money and their energy. Is it matching up with the priorities that we say we have? So all of that, in recap, is just finding a way to get started today and really trusting in tiny steps to get there, and finding the support that you need to actually make it happen, because yeah, nobody should have to do it alone.
That's awesome. That's great. Okay, so why don't you also tell our listeners where they can get in touch with you? And we'll obviously have that link. We'll include the link to your podcast as well, a little bit of bio about you. Where's the main place other than, going and checking out your podcast? Where else should people go to connect with you?
Absolutely. My website is www.amybeheimercoaching.com, and that will be in the show notes. But there are free resources in addition to the podcast. There are ways that we can work together. I actually have a monthly membership where we really put all of this into action to get started today. And yeah, I would invite anybody who's curious to get started and get ready to learn and take action on these things in a way that feels good. And just because I love rhyming, the podcast is called The Habit Hub for Autoimmune Health, and the membership is Club Habit Hub. So I encourage anybody to come to the website, check it out, and even if they're just curious, come by and grab some free resources. I would love to help support you.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thanks so much for sharing with us today. Like I said, we'll have the links below, and check those out and get in touch with her if you have any additional questions, and go check out her podcast as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anna Laura.
Absolutely.